World of Warfare presents the Battle of Kursk. The summer sun rises over the English Channel, revealing a fleet of Allied ships heading from ports in Great Britain for the French coast. Over the previous year or more, the Allies had quietly been building up their troop strength and industrial output of war weapons, leading up to today's show of offensive might as a large Allied fighting force was about to land on a handful of French beaches. The first wave of over 6,000 men took to the beachheads with relative ease, thanks to cover support by the Royal Air Force, who successfully kept the Luftwaffe at bay. But what was meant to be a resounding display of Allied strength quickly devolved into a blood-soaked slaughter on the beaches, when some 3,500 Canadians and 275 British soldiers fell or were captured by the Germans, resulting in a sobering loss rate of 58%. Not to be confused with the D-Day invasions in June of 1944, the Allies' first attempt in August of 1942 proved that a cross-channel attack from England was a very dangerous proposition, when Wehrmacht forces successfully repelled the Allies at the fortified French fishing village of Dieppe. Initially, the raid was meant to be a test of how hard it would be to bring troops across the Channel, while its disastrous outcome convinced Winston Churchill that landing troops in France would be an act of outright suicide. But as Russian casualties mounted on the Eastern Front, Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin's call for a second front became increasingly urgent, convincing Allied war leaders of the need to return to Europe no matter the cost. Stalin's demands reached a new zenith in the autumn of 1943, when the big three Allied war leaders met in Tehran, where Stalin insisted that a two-front war could be won much faster if the Allies equally shared the burden of war in terms of manpower and spilled blood. Yet to understand Stalin's intense demands at Tehran, the roots of his obstinacy are better understood at the Battle of Stalingrad, which had come to a close just 4 months prior. Considered the industrial heartland of Russia, Hitler ordered his Wehrmacht to attack and occupy Stalingrad in July of 1942, not just to slow the production of Russian war material, but also for propaganda purposes, since the city was named after Hitler's archenemy, Joseph Stalin. After Hitler proclaimed that all the city's male residents would be killed and the women deported, Stalin ordered all Russians in and around Stalingrad to take up arms in defense of the city. The Wehrmacht's 6th Army began their assault on August 23rd of 1942, but were successfully repelled in skirmishes near the city at a cost to the Russians of nearly 200,000 casualties. Over the next several days, the German Luftwaffe rendered the Volga River impassable for maritime traffic, and by September, the Luftwaffe gained air supremacy over Stalingrad, bombing the city into ruins by the fall of that same year. With less than 20,000 Russian troops in the city and more than 300,000 Nazi and Axis forces closing in, Russian generals called for a massive influx of reinforcements, which effectively encircled Germany's positions in an offensive known as Operation Uranus. In the fall of 1942, fighting in the now destroyed city had become a study in savagery and tenacity on both sides of the conflict. And when the German 6th Army conceivably could have proven victorious at Stalingrad, the Germans failed in their bid to encircle the 62nd and 64th Soviet armies, the last two formations defending the remains of the city. With 7/8 of the city under German occupation by October, newly appointed 62nd Army Commander General Georgy Zhukov found his forces pinned against the western banks of the Volga River, where battered ferries from the Russian-held East Bank ran a gauntlet of bomber and artillery fire to keep the trapped defenders supplied with ample food and munitions. With Russian positions close to being overrun by the Nazis, Zhukov's inspirational leadership devised a series of nighttime raids in late October that regained important strongpoints which they had given up during daytime fighting. Conditions on both sides have since been referred to as a complete and utter orgy of violence, where Soviet and German fighters laid down uninterrupted fire amidst the rubble of Stalingrad, where combatants fought hand-to-hand not for control of a sector of the front lines, but rather control of a single room in a single bombed-out house, only to devolve further as Stalingrad's bitter winter conditions set in. By November, Hitler's geographic overreach at last doomed his eastern campaign when he disregarded his German high command by sending Army Group A into the Caucasus, while simultaneously advancing Army Group B on Stalingrad, leaving only one division to guard a nearly 200-mile-wide gap between the armies, which handed the Soviets a golden and quite obvious opportunity. After months of planning, on November 19th, Stalin indeed took the initiative by launching a counterattack that routed Romanian troops north of Stalingrad, who subsequently broke out and fled. While 100 miles to the south, the Red Army overran a force of German and Romanian soldiers in a pincer maneuver, which allowed the two Red Army forces to encircle the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad by November 22nd, trapping the Germans with only 6 days of food and 2 days of ammunition. While several attempts were made to supply the trapped Sixth Army by Luftwaffe airlifts, by early January of 1943, the situation for the Sixth Army reached a point of progressive deterioration. On January 8th, the Russians offered German General Friedrich Paulus terms of surrender as a humanitarian gesture. However, Hitler refused to capitulate. As a result, throughout the remainder of the month, Sixth Army troops began collapsing from starvation, exhaustion, and exposure, while still others opted to end their lives at their own hands rather than wither away from lack of food or warmth. When Hitler made Paulus a field marshal on January 31st, on the 1st of February, Paulus surrendered to the Soviets, making him the first field marshal since the unification of Germany to fall into enemy hands. Victory, however, had come at a great cost for the Soviets, with 1.1 million to 1.5 million troop casualties and 40,000 civilians killed, a staggering loss of human life that further fueled Stalin's obstinacy at the Turan Conference of 1943. Despite his humiliating losses at Stalingrad, Hitler's obsession over bringing down the Great Bolshevik Bear would not be dampened due to his pathological fixation for the destruction of the Soviet Union and the defeat of Stalin. His opportunity presented itself at the little-known Russian town of Kursk, where the Red Army's success had moved so far in advance of surrounding troops and supply lines by early 1943, creating a 120-mile bulge or salient around Kursk, which sufficiently exposed them to a pincer maneuver by the Germans. Smelling Soviet blood when he recognized the bulge, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein laid his plan out to Hitler himself, explaining how he planned to encircle the Soviets at Kursk, which would effectively isolate roughly 600,000 Soviet fighters. Instead, much to Manstein's surprise, Hitler wanted to wait until the Germans' 2 new tank designs could reach the Eastern Front in sufficient numbers to defeat the Soviets' now dominant T-34 tank. Despite his creation of the plan, both veteran German commanders Manstein and Heinz Guderian doubted the possible success of the plan, leading Guderian to issue his blunt assessment during a meeting with Hitler by stating, "Why attack in the East at all in 1943? If the Spitfire saved Britain, then the T-34 had so far done the same for Russia." Equipped with a V-12 engine boasting 500 horsepower, what stood out most about the T-34 was the simple fact that it ran on diesel, which freezes at a far lower temperature than the Germans' gas-powered Panzers. During the winter of 1942 and 43, this one simple fact handed the Soviets a marked advantage, since the Germans had to light fires under their tanks to stop the gas from freezing up at night. Another advantage of the T-34 was its sloped armor, which gave Soviet tank crews additional protection without additional weight, at the same time frustrating German tank crews in early tank battles when their shells literally bounced off the hull of Russian tanks. In response, the Germans reverse-engineered a captured T-34 tank to produce a close but much larger replica tank called the Panther. Equipped with a cannon capable of breaching T-34 armor at medium range, the Panther also possessed twice the armor of a T-34, yet remained faster across the ground. Hitler also wanted to wait for one other new tank design in the Panzer VI, or its more famous name, the Tiger tank, which packed a 88mm cannon that could pierce T-34 armor from a mile away. The Germans also added yet another lethal and massive tank destroyer known as the Ferdinand tank destroyer, or Elefante, which packed a whopping 8.8mm cannon. During Germany's 1941 invasion of the Soviet Union under Operation Barbarossa, the Germans had executed 15,000 civilians at Kursk before they press-ganged 30,000 more into forced labor battalions. After the Germans were at last pushed from the area by Russian breakneck mobilization of men in Russian industry, terrified locals helped Zhukov's troops dig an incredible 3,000 miles of trenches around the greater Kursk region, burying nearly 5,000 mines per mile and a staggering 1 million in total. Combined with outstanding Soviet intelligence that alerted the Red Army to Germany's Operation Citadel playbook well in advance of the Nazis' offensive, Zhukov's end result was a 50-mile zone of deep defenses around Kursk in 8 defensive belts, including anti-tank trenches, anti-tank mines, and anti-tank obstacles reminiscent of the Western Front during the First World War. When Hitler at last launched Operation Citadel on July the 5th of 1943, Russia maintained a numerical upper hand, with 2 million soldiers, more than 5,000 tanks, and 25,000 artillery pieces, under the command of Konstantin Rokossovsky in the north and Nikolai Vatutin in the south, while vast amounts of men under Zhukov's command waited in reserve, an almost 2-to-1 advantage over the Germans in both troop strength and strategic weapons. What happened over the next few days would develop into one of the most decisive battles in world military history, on equal footing with Napoleon's loss at the Battle of Waterloo, as well as the largest tank battle in the history of mechanized warfare. Just before dawn on July the 5th, the silence of the Russian countryside was shattered by Soviet artillery fire, as thousands of guns pounded German assembly points in a preemptive strike intended to disrupt the offensive. German artillery quickly answered from Walter Model's German Ninth Army to the north, while Hermann Hoth's powerful 4th Panzer Army opened up from the south. The fields around Kursk quickly became a cauldron of steel, death, and fire, as German tanks rolled forward across fields riddled with mines. Many Panthers and Tiger tanks rushed into service without sufficient testing, broke down or caught fire, while Ferdinand Elefantes proved powerful but vulnerable to infantry due to their lack of machine guns. The Germans' grinding advance moved at a painfully slow pace, every mile costing hundreds of casualties, with only 4 miles gained by the end of the first day. In the northern sector, Model's forces attacked through the defenses of Rokossovsky's central front, where the terrain favored the defenders. Dense minefields and strategically placed anti-tank guns forced German armor into narrow corridors, where they made easy prey for Soviet artillery batteries. German engineers struggled courageously to clear pathways through minefields while under constant enemy fire, making progress measured in yards rather than miles. By the 3rd day of the battle, German forces had advanced no more than 10 miles, leaving Model with a strong realization that the Soviets' defenses were deeper and stronger than anyone had anticipated, along with the truth that his northern offensive had stalled. In the south, however, Hoth's offensive proved much more dangerous for Soviet defenders, when his 4th Panzer Army and his elite 2nd SS Panzer Corps collided with resolute fury against Soviet defenses. Among the attack units were the famous and experienced Waffen-SS divisions of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, and the 3rd SS Panzer Division Totenkopf. Together, these formations pushed deeper into the Soviet defensive belts, turning village after village into lethal battlegrounds, while tank duels erupted frequently across rolling hills and wheat fields of ever-increasing carnage and death. By mid-July, the Germans had pushed to a small rail junction village south of Kursk known as Prokhorovsk, a name which would soon become legendary in the annals of military history. It was at Prokhorovsk that Soviet forces launched their desperate counterattack on July the 12th, which was led by General Pavel Rotmitrov's 5th Guards Tank Army, when hundreds of T-34 tanks closed in on the Germans at full speed, with orders to destroy Panthers and Tiger tanks at point-blank range. The result was pure chaos, as dust clouds swallowed tanks and infantry, until visibility was measured in yards and feet, stripping the Germans' long-range advantage for both their newly introduced tanks. Enemy tanks collided blindly, while others slammed shells into armor at close range, littering the fields around Prokhorovsk with burning wrecks, leaving infantry to fight among the smoldering hulks. It became a game of who could turn the turret fastest, who could get their gun onto the enemy more quickly at very close range. By nightfall, after hours of intense fighting, destroyed tanks littered the battlefield with enormous casualties on both sides of the conflict. Yet what was most telling about the day's events at Prokhorovsk was the fact that the German advance had been permanently halted. As the battle raged in the south of Russia, events elsewhere forced Hitler to reconsider his offensive in the east, when on July the 10th, Allied forces came ashore in Sicily. Hitler quickly summoned his generals to Berlin, where on July 13th, he canceled Operation Citadel with the hope of deploying more of his limited resources to repel the Allies from their Mediterranean foothold. Instead, the Red Army seized the initiative under Operation Kutuzov, which saw a massive Soviet force attack the German-held city of Orel, followed by their August offensive aimed at the liberation of southern Ukraine, which put the retreating German army on the defensive across the entirety of the Eastern Front. In fact, after the Battle of Kursk, Germany never again launched a major strategic offensive on the Eastern Front. The final tally was gruesome after the Battle of Kursk ground on for nearly 2 months, killing or wounding some 800,000 Red Army soldiers and 200,000 Germans. Soviet material losses stood at 6,064 tanks, 3,000 aircraft, and 5,244 guns and mortars destroyed, while the Germans witnessed 2,952 tanks and assault guns destroyed or damaged, as well as 1,300 aircraft destroyed, making the Battle of Kursk a turning point moment during the Soviets' accelerating push for Berlin.